In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you why daggers are the best weapon in Elden Ring. This is our 21st video in a series of videos about different weapons and the weapons inside their weapon groups, kind of going through the pros and cons of each one of those weapons and helping you make better decisions about why or why not you might use that weapon in your build. Before we get into the weapons themselves, however, I want to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of the weapon group itself and the playstyles I think most people who are using daggers will use. So let's get into the pros of daggers first, and the first thing to know about daggers is they have a very fast attack speed compared to most other weapons in Elden Ring. So you're going to be able to hit enemies rapidly with this weapon, particularly when dual wielding. Their dual wield moveset is very fast as well, and it allows them to make good use of things like Rotten Winged Sword Insignia or Millicent's Prosthesis in order to build up your attack power rapidly. Another thing daggers have going for them is their critical rating. They typically have higher critical rating than most weapons in the game. Most daggers have 110 or higher critical rating, although there are a handful of ones that are only 100, which is pretty typical for weapons in Elden Ring, which allows them to get more critical damage than a lot of other weapon groups. So if you find yourself doing, critical attacks, particularly backstabs with this weapon, because block counters are not very effective at breaking an enemy's stance in order to get you to do a critical attack. So you're probably talking about, in this case, either parrying or doing backstabs. And the last pro of this weapon group is that they're extremely lightweight, with the heaviest dagger weighing 3 and the lightest weighing 1.5, which allows you to pack an extra dagger with you for no problem, or to make your dagger build and manage your equip weight very easily. The negatives of this weapon type are that they have just about lower attack rating than any other weapon in the game, so you're not going to deal a ton of damage per hit, even though you can attack quickly with them, which kind of makes up for that. And that dual wielding used to be a great way for this weapon group to set status effects, but because that was nerfed a few patches ago, they're not as good at setting status effects as they once were with their dual wield moveset. And lastly, this weapon type has extremely short reach compared to any other weapon in Elden Ring, which makes it so that you can miss attacks more easily, particularly when dual wielding. When you're pressed up against the body of a weird shaped enemy, sometimes your attacks will just not hit them. The playstyles I think most people will use when using a dagger in Elden Ring are basically dual wielding in order to get rapid attacks and set some status effects even if it takes longer than it used to, and to build up their attack power using things like Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, etc. Or they might use them as a backup for like a critical build where they have a longer reaching weapon, and then when they stance break something, they might pull out a dagger and go in for a critical strike. That's typically, you're not normally going to see someone do a parry build with only a dagger. They might use something else like a rapier or something like that. But you might have a build that does stance breaks regularly, and you want to just swap to a dagger real quick to go in for a critical attack. Those are the ways I see most people using them. There's obviously other ways, but I think those are the primary two ways people play daggers in Elden Ring. So let's get into the unique daggers first before we get into the infusible ones, and the first one is the Scorpion's Stinger. The Scorpion's Stinger has a unique R2 attack shared with the Misericorde and Glintstone Kris, and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a dagger in Elden Ring weighing 2.5 and requires 6 strength and 12 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Scorpion's Stinger is the only dagger with Scarlet Rot buildup, and it's one of the longer daggers in Elden Ring, and it can deal slash or thrust damage effectively thanks to its thrusting heavy attack. However, you won't find this until late into the game in the Lake of Rot. Repeating thrust is a decent weapon skill, especially since 2 uses of it is usually enough to set Scarlet Rot on bosses, and is faster than trying to set it while dual wielding daggers. The downside is that daggers have a short range in general, making it so you need to be very close to the target to hit it easily with repeating thrust. The sweet spot for this weapon is around minimum strength and 50 dexterity, but the weapon scales well up to 80 dexterity where it drops off significantly. Strength does provide some damage, but not a ton, making this weapon better used on the first playthrough than a subsequent one. However, since you cannot get it until late into the game, you won't be able to do that unless someone drops you one. I like to use this weapon as a means to set Scarlet Rot as a backup weapon since it weighs very little, or you can use it with the Jellyfish Shield buffing your attack power with it, leaning into the rapid attacks and high critical damage of daggers in general. Next we come to the Cinquedea. The Cinquedea shares the default moveset of most other daggers and deals physical damage. It's the heaviest dagger in Elden Ring weighing 3.5, requires 10 strength and 10 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Cinquedea can be found pretty quickly outside Bestial Sanctum and is one of the longest daggers in Elden Ring, has high attack rating for a dagger, and buffs bestial incantations by 10%, which stacks with the Sacred Seal. However, it only has 100 crit rating, which is lower than most other daggers. Quick Step is an okay weapon skill, especially since it can help position you for backstabs more easily. You won't use it all the time, though. The sweet spot for this weapon is 50 strength and minimum dexterity, but scales well up to 80 strength, and dexterity doesn't scale that poorly. However, this makes it a much better first playthrough weapon than a second playthrough weapon. The Cinquedea is in a weird spot because you're either using it simply as a buff stick to cast bestial incantations and not using it for attacks at all, or if you decide to build for damage, you have to add points into Faith in order to cast bestial incantations, which lowers your overall attack rating of the weapon since it doesn't scale with Faith. Additionally, you cannot buff this weapon with your incantations like you can other daggers. And if you simply want to use it as a dagger and not worry about its incantation buff, you'll have high attack rating, but you'll have poor critical damage, making it sort of a bad trade unless you're dual wielding. I'd either use this in a bestial incantation build, splitting points between strength and faith and mailing with this weapon only as needed, or using it in a dual wield dagger build that focuses on high damage per swing and doesn't worry about status effects. Up next is the Glintstone Kris. The Glintstone Kris shares a unique R2 attack with the Misericorde and Scorpion Stinger, and deals physical and magic damage. It's tied for the lightest dagger in Elden Ring, weighing 1.5, and requires 5 strength, 12 dexterity, and 16 intelligence in order to use effectively. The Glintstone Kris might be my favorite dagger in Elden Ring. At first glance, there isn't a lot that separates this from other daggers, and you can't find it until quite late into the game from doing a quest line, but let me tell you why it's so good. Glintstone Dart, its weapon skill, is similar to Glintstone Pebble in a lot of ways, but there are some key differences. Glintstone Dart does more damage than Glintstone Pebble when it comes to the projectile portion, and not by a small amount. Additionally, Glintstone Dart can pierce enemies while Glintstone Pebble cannot, though Glintstone Dart does cost 2 more FP to use per cast, which I think is more than worth it. However, you can charge Glintstone Dart by holding L2, increasing its damage even further. This gives you a deadly ranged option as well as a quick melee option without the need of any spells. The sweet spot for this weapon is around 40 dex and 50 int, but you can increase int higher instead of dex in order to use spells if you prefer, reducing your melee damage by a very small amount. Additionally, intelligence increases Glintstone Dart damage and dex only increases the follow-up attack. I like to use this weapon in a dual-wield setup with another int dex scaling dagger like the Crystal Knife, using Glintstone Dart as needed when range is called for. Use talismans like Shard of Alexander, Magic Scorpion Charm, Millicent's Prosthesis, and Godfrey Icon to further boost your Glintstone Dart damage. Next up is the Reduvia. The Reduvia shares the default attack of most daggers and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a dagger in Elden Ring, weighing 2.5, and requires 5 strength, 13 dexterity, and 13 arcane in order to use effectively. Reduvia is a fantastic dagger for those looking to take advantage of the hemorrhage status effect, and is probably the best dagger for it since the dual-wield status effect nerf. You can also get this weapon very early on in Limgrave, allowing you to take advantage of it right away, with the only real downside being lower attack rating than many other unique daggers. Reduvia Bloodblade is an exceptional weapon skill that does 100% physical damage, is relatively cheap, and does hemorrhage buildup at range, even though its damage is modest. However, when connecting with the blade and the projectile at the same time since patch 1.07, you get insane hemorrhage buildup, allowing you to trigger it in one hit many times, or at most 2 times, making the strategy for this weapon to range when necessary, but generally get up close and spam this weapon skill. The sweet spot for this weapon is around 55 arcane with minimum points in dex, but dex scales okay up to 50. Arcane will increase the hemorrhage buildup though, so you want to prioritize this when leveling up. I like to play this weapon with Reduvia in one hand and the Dragon Communion Seal in the other, which will allow you to cast some spells effectively, while also using Reduvia Bloodblade. Flame Grant Me Strength is particularly effective with this weapon since it deals 100% physical damage, so 15 Faith is a solid investment here. Swarm of Flies is also a good incantation to use as well, since it can further add to blade buildup. Be sure to use Lord of Blood's Exaltation and White Mask with this weapon for the attack power increase when setting the hemorrhage status effect. Up next, we come to the Blade of Calling. The Blade of Calling has a unique R2 attack shared with the Erdsteel Dagger and Black Knife, and deals physical and holy damage. It's tied for the lightest dagger in Elden Ring, weighing 1.5, and requires 6 strength, 13 dexterity, and 15 faith in order to use effectively. The Blade of Calling is a solid dagger. It's extremely lightweight, its heavy attack hits twice rapidly, allowing you to use Millicent's Prosthesis or Rottenwing Sword Insignia easily. However, you can't get this weapon until way late into the game, near mountaintops of the giants, and holy damage is resisted by many endgame bosses, and it's one of the shorter daggers. Blade of Gold, its weapon skill does 100% holy damage and does a substantial amount of it at decent range, and knocks enemies down. This allows you to pick off enemies at range, and if you can get into the air, then you're almost uninterruptible. You can also buff this damage easily with Sacred Scorpion Charm, Shard of Alexander, Ritual Sword Talisman, and Holy Shroud and Cracked Tear. The sweet spot for this weapon is around 50 Faith and 50 Dexterity, but Blade of Gold only increases in damage with Faith, and if you want to cast incantations effectively, you'll likely want to sacrifice some Dexterity in order to reach higher Faith initially, but eventually you'll want to increase Dexterity. I like to play this weapon with very high Faith, allowing you to get the most from Blade of Gold, but also to use the Erdtree Seal and cast incantations very effectively. And then we come to the last unique dagger, the Black Knife. The Black Knife has a unique R2 attack shared with the Erdsteel Dagger and Blade of Calling and deals physical and holy damage. It has an average weight for a dagger in Elden Ring weighing 2 and requires 8 strength, 12 dexterity, and 18 faith in order to use. The Black Knife is a fan favorite dagger for a lot of reasons. The heavy attacks strike twice rapidly just like Blade of Calling. It has the highest attack rating of unique daggers, and Blade of Death rips off 10% of the max HP of the target. However, it might not be better than Blade of Calling, and here's why. Blade of Death does less damage overall when compared with Blade of Gold, and Blade of Gold costs 17 FP compared to the 25 FP of Blade of Death. Faith impacts the damage of both Blade of Gold and Blade of Death, and Blade of Calling has slightly better Faith scaling. You can get Black Knife earlier than Blade of Calling though, making it better for a first playthrough. The sweet spot for this weapon is around 55 Dexterity and minimum Faith, but the weapon scales okay up to 50 Faith as well. Since only Faith impacts Blade of Death damage, you might want to consider prioritizing this stat, particularly if you want to cast incantations effectively while using this weapon. I like to use this weapon to stack max HP debuffs on bosses when combined with either Destined Death or Blade of Death, or using it in a similar manner as Blade of Calling, but with less Faith and mailing a bit more frequently. So then we come to the regular daggers in Elden Ring, or the infusible ones. First up is the dagger itself. The dagger shares the default moveset of most other daggers and deals physical damage. It's tied for the lightest dagger in Elden Ring, weighing 1.5, and requires 5 strength and 9 dexterity in order to use effectively. The dagger is actually one of the better daggers in Elden Ring. Not only can you get it quite early from Round Table Hold, but it's tied for lightest dagger, and more importantly, it has the second highest crit rating of all weapons in Elden Ring behind the Misericorde. The biggest downsides are that it's the shortest dagger in Elden Ring, and also has pretty low attack rating for a dagger. Infusion-wise, Fire and Lightning comes in first at 474, with Magic just behind at 468, and Sacred and Flame Art at 465. Keen outperforms Heavy 416 to 397, with Cold in between at 406. I like to use this weapon in a critical-focused build that takes advantage of the high critical rating of the weapon. You can use it with Glintstone Phalanx for easy stance breaks, or you can use it in a parry build. Both are good options. Make sure to use the Dagger Talisman for further increases to critical damage. Up next, we have the Parrying Dagger. The Parrying Dagger shares the default moveset of most other daggers and deals physical damage. It is tied for the lightest dagger in Elden Ring, weighing 1.5, and requires 5 strength and 14 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Parrying Dagger is aptly named as it gives similar iframes to a small shield using the parry skill, if only slightly worse. It can be acquired early on in Limgrave and is tied for the lightest dagger in the game. However, it is one of the shortest daggers and has higher dex requirements than any other dagger. Infusion-wise, Fire and Lightning comes in first at 476, with Magic at second at 472, and Sacred and Flame Art at third at 456. Keen outperforms Heavy 428 to 403, with Cold being in the middle at 417. If you're using the Parrying Dagger, you might as well lean into this aspect in order to play a parrying build. However, since you can do this effectively with the Parrying Dagger instead of a shield, you can dual-wield daggers and still parry just fine. Make sure to use the Dagger Talisman for increased critical damage, and use Millicent's Prosthesis or Rotten Wing Sword Insignia for increased attack power via repeated attacks when you're dual wielding. Next we come to the Misericorde. The Misericorde has a unique R2 attack shared with the Scorpion Stinger and Glintstone Kris, and deals physical damage, and has an average weight for a dagger in Elden Ring weighing 2, and requires 7 strength and 12 dexterity in order to use. The Misericorde has the highest critical rating of any weapon in Elden Ring, while simultaneously also being the longest dagger in the game. You can also get this in Stormveil Castle, which is very early on, allowing you to use it very quickly. Infusion-wise, Fire and Lightning comes in first at 480, with Magic at 472, and Sacred and Flame Art at 460. Keen barely outperforms Heavy 413 to 404, with Gold outperforming both. Because the critical rating of this weapon is so high, it makes sense to play a critical focused build with this weapon that allows you to take advantage of it. Because Heavy is nearly as good as Keen, you can even use a strength-based large weapon, and then swap to this weapon for critical attacks if you want. Otherwise, you can parry with Carry and Retaliation on a shield rather easily. Make sure to use the Dagger Talisman for more critical damage. Up next is the Great Knife. The Great Knife shares the default moveset of most other daggers and deals physical damage. It's tied for the lightest dagger in Elden Ring, weighing 1.5, and requires 6 strength and 12 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Great Knife is a solid dagger. Bandits begin the game with it, it has native bleed buildup on hit, and it's one of the lightest daggers in the game. The only real negative is that it's also one of the shortest daggers. Infusion-wise, Fire and Lightning comes in first, with Magic a close second, and Sacred and Flameheart in third. Keen outperforms Heavy 426 to 399, with Cold splitting the difference at 419. I recommend using this weapon for a status effect build that either focuses on poison and bleed or just bleed, although I think Reduvia is better for a pure bleed build. Use Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Kindred of Rot's Exaltation, and Millicent's Prosthesis, or Rotten Winged Sword Insignia for attack power boosts. Next is the Bloodstained Dagger. The Bloodstained Dagger shares the default moveset of most other daggers and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a dagger in Elden Ring weighing 2 and requires 9 strength and 12 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Bloodstained Dagger is the go-to option for those wanting to use a dagger with superb strength scaling. This weapon can be farmed early on in Weeping Peninsula and has native bleed buildup on hit. The biggest downside is that it's rather short for a dagger. Infusion-wise, Magic comes in first at 484, with Fire and Lightning nearly the same at 482, and Sacred and Flameheart pulling up a distant third. Heavy outperforms Keen by nearly 30 attack rating, with Cold outperforming Heavy. Use this weapon in a dual-wield setup like I did with the Crystal Knife, or use it in a build that uses a Great Shield to give you a blocking option while you slash away at enemies with quick block counters and R1 attacks. Next we come to the Erdsteel Dagger. The Erdsteel Dagger has a unique R2 attack shared with the Blade of Calling and Black Knife, and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a dagger in Elden Ring weighing 2 and requires 7 strength and 12 dexterity and 15 faith in order to use. The Erdsteel Dagger is quite special, as it's the only faith scaling weapon in Elden Ring that does 100% physical damage that can still be buffed. You can acquire 2 of them as well, but it has the lowest attack rating of any dagger in Elden Ring, except if you're playing with the Sacred or Flameheart infusions. Then it has the highest attack rating of all daggers. Sacred and Flameheart come in at a whopping 544 attack rating, with Magic way far behind at 410, Fire and Lightning in third at 384. Keen outperforms Heavy by 13 attack rating, and Cold barely breaks 300 attack rating. The best way to use this weapon is probably to dual wield 2 of these set to Flameheart or Sacred, or using one in the offhand with another unique dagger in the right hand like Black Knife or Blade of Calling. Crank Faith and buff with Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength for even more damage, and you can reach over 1000 attack power with 2 Erdsteel Daggers when set up this way, which is ridiculous. Next is the Wakizashi. The Wakizashi shares the default moveset of most other daggers and deals physical damage. It's the heaviest dagger in Elden Ring weighing 3 and requires 9 strength and 13 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Wakizashi is an interesting weapon because even though it is classified as a dagger, it cannot be power stanced with other daggers, but can be with other katanas, has native bleed buildup just like they do, and has the highest attack rating of all daggers generally, and is the heaviest dagger. This would lead one to believe that it's not really a dagger and more of a katana, especially since it has a 100 crit rating just like other katanas. Infusion-wise, Magic comes in first at 522 attack rating, with Sacred and Flameheart and Fire and Lightning basically tied for second. Keen outperforms Heavy by a small amount, and Cold outperforms both of them. You can power stance this weapon with an Uchi Katana or another katana if you wish, if you don't happen to have a second Uchi Katana, but I don't really see much of other way that you would use this weapon, since likely you won't just be using a single Wakizashi when you could use an Uchi Katana as a single weapon, or as a single weapon in shield, because that weapon has a much longer reach and has higher damage. Next is the Celebrant Sickle. The Celebrant Sickle shares the default moveset of most other daggers and deals physical damage. It's tied for the lightest dagger in Elden Ring, weighing 1.5 and requires 6 strength and 11 dexterity in order to use effectively. The Celebrant Sickle is not the greatest dagger in Elden Ring. You won't find it until late into the game in Windmill Village if you can be bothered to farm it, and it has 100 crit rating, which is bad for a dagger. However, it is tied for the lightest dagger in Elden Ring, and it does grant 10 runes per hit, and some of its damage does go through enemy shields. Infusion-wise, Fire and Lightning comes in first, Magic just behind, and Sacred and Flameheart coming in at third. Keen outperforms Heavy by 40 attack rating, and Cold splits the difference. It is likely that you'll have a better dagger by the time you can farm this weapon, but if you insist on doing so, probably the best way to play it is by using 2 of them in order to get 10 runes per hit very quickly. Stack buffs like Millicent's Prosthesis and Winged Sword Insignia to boost attack power. Next is the Ivory Sickle. The Ivory Sickle shares the default moveset of most other daggers and deals physical and magic damage. It has an average weight for a dagger in Elden Ring weighing 2 and requires 6 strength, 11 dexterity, and 13 intelligence in order to use effectively. There are not a lot of great ways to use this dagger. It cannot be buffed or infused despite not being unique, and it has 100 crit rating, which is terrible for a dagger. The upside is that you can find it pretty early on in the village of the Albinaurics, and it's one of the longest daggers in Elden Ring. The sweet spot for this weapon is right about 55 intelligence and 45 dexterity with nearly 50-50 split damage types between physical and magic. You could prioritize intelligence if you want and want to be a spellcaster with this weapon as a backup. I like to put this weapon in my offhand and use it in a dual-wield build where you will neither need its weapon skill nor its critical rating, and it scales similarly to the Glintstone Kris, which is a good pairing with the Kris in the main hand for a better skill and crit rating. You could also use a cold-infused dagger of some kind as well with another weapon skill in the main hand if you don't want to wait to get the Kris. Up next is the Crystal Knife. The Crystal Knife shares the default moveset of most other daggers and deals physical and magic damage. It has an average weight for a dagger in Elden Ring weighing 2 and requires 8 strength, 12 dexterity, and 9 intelligence in order to use effectively. Similar to the Ivory Sickle, the Crystal Knife cannot be buffed nor infused, but it's not a unique dagger. It's also one of the shortest daggers in the game and has 100 crit rating, which is, again, not good for a dagger. However, you can find it quite early in Rhea Lucaria Academy, and it has pretty high attack rating for a dagger. The sweet spot for this weapon is around 50 strength and 50 intelligence, though dexterity doesn't scale too badly, and it's likely you'll take it up to 50 after these two, which makes this weapon good for New Game Plus. I like to put this weapon in my offhand and use it in a dual-wield build where you'll neither need its weapon skill nor its critical rating, and it scales similarly to the Bloodstained Dagger when it's set to the Cold Infusion. This allows you to select a better Ash of War for the Bloodstained Dagger, while still getting the high attack rating from the Crystal Knife. So that wraps up our video on why daggers are the best weapon in Elden Ring. I think it's pretty clear to see at this point that daggers are definitely not the best weapon type, but there are some really, really strong daggers in this game, and I think you'd be surprised once you set your mind to it and you just try and play with a dagger, what you can accomplish, particularly with the very high critical rating that most of these weapons have. Stay tuned because we got more Elden Ring content coming as we draw closer to Shadow of the Erdtree in just over a month. We're going to be wrapping up our weapon videos, doing some more builds, etc. And if you guys have any questions about these daggers, or if you have comments, things and tips that I missed about some of them, feel free to leave them in the comments below.